Well, it wasn't the smartest choice. Years and years ago, like many of us out there, I'm sure, we thought it'd be a good idea to upgrade the radio in this 1990 Mustang. Spoiler, wasn't a good idea. And, I got all new speakers, mini sub under the front passenger side seat, an aftermarket head unit. I believe it was a KD HDR60. So, anyway, got that, and it served its purpose. I was a daily driver for a while, now at around 130,000 miles. Ready to basically undo everything and go back to factory. Unfortunately for me, I have no idea what happened to that original radio, but I did stumble on the specialist Todd Lane on Facebook. He works on a lot of these radios. He actually sent me, the model that was specific to my year, beautifully cleaned up factory radio that he actually also installed Bluetooth in, which is pretty cool, but a good OEM look. But now, I have a bit of a mess to deal with, so I go and I pull the head unit. The amp is gone, all that's left are basically a bunch of splices and a mess of wires. And so I spent hours and hours and hours trying to figure out what all this is, what it should look like, and how to undo everything I did. Now there are some pretty decent resources out there. They're not that comprehensive, so I figured I'd summarize everything I've learned, made some diagrams to lay it all out, and hopefully I can help someone else who's dealing with their or their previous owner's bad decisions. Alright, so let's start with the basics. So from 1987 to 92 model years, Ford gave you the option of a premium or a non-premium configuration. I believe the radio head unit was the same, but the speakers were completely different, and there was no amp in the non-premium, so you just had wires from the radio straight out to 4 full-range, low-impedance speakers only in the dash and in the rear, so no door speakers, but connection points, I believe, if you did want to add them in the future. Now, this video isn't going to be heavily focused on non-premium. A lot of the video may apply, but I was mainly focused on premium, which does have some interesting nuance to it. For one, they obviously add in the small 4-channel factory football amp, as it's known, into the mix. And that signal goes out to 6 much higher impedance speakers, 2 in the rear, 2 in the door, and then those door speakers are tied in parallel to 2 dash speakers. Now, normally, when you tie speakers in parallel like that, it can actually really stress the amp. But I guess Ford designed those dash speakers with special capacitors, which filtered out all of the low end, so it wasn't nearly as power hungry. So that premium setup is what the Focus is today. And then apparently there's another system with like a full-on EQ adjustment. I don't really know much about that one. I know that the amps are different. So here's the one with the EQ on the left, which has a green connection point, while the standard premium radio amps are both gray. I've seen amps with both holes like the one on the top and a flat surface like the one on the bottom. I think they're the same. The ones with the holes I think were just older models with the same internal components, but someone please correct me if that's wrong. And then there's also another model out there I've seen that uses a grounding cable and it has a different connection style. I'm not really sure about that one. But the standard connection on the right is a single notch connector that goes out to the speakers and a double notch for the wires connected to the radio. Now, lastly, you might have heard a lot about the 1993 premium system, which had an upgraded radio head unit and an amp under the passenger seat. If you want more information on that, Mustang 5L5 has a good video. I'll link that in the description. For me, I wanted to stick to the radio specific to this model year. So yeah, let's get into it. Alright, so in trying to figure all this out, I thought it'd be a little easier to just do everything, so I took out the passenger seat to access the subwoofer that was here, the center console to get better access behind the radio. I did the dash speakers, took off the door panel to get access to the door speakers, and then the rear speakers took out here. I used a lot of late model restoration videos for that. You don't necessarily have to go this extreme, but it definitely helped me figure out, where everything was going. And I ended up creating this kind of busy diagram here. So obviously this may be different depending on your system and how it was installed if it was aftermarket. In my case, they cut these wires right here where they originally exited the amp to go off into the individual speakers. And they also use the power cables to supply power to the aftermarket head unit. We can see, if I pull this out, you can see the power cables that were here and the speaker wires that were here, all spliced in to go to the new system. Doesn't have an amp because the head unit supplies enough power that it's not necessary. We also have the powered subwoofer that gets its power directly from the battery. You can see it coming in through the firewall right there. In under the carpet, connects here, and then the ground connects directly to the frame right there. We have the RCA cables from the radio that come out onto the carpet again, connect here. And then the last piece is the remote amp turn on for the subwoofer, so that it only turns on when it detects a signal. Those also run in through the RCA cables, split here and then connect right here. All right, and then the last thing for the dash speakers, because these are aftermarket and they don't have that special capacitor we were talking about that helps them run with lower power. Also where they connect to the door speakers, I believe, is behind this panel, which I'm not even sure they knew. What they ended up doing was running a separate line out to each speaker. Dash speaker, and what that helped them do was actually run the door and the dash in series instead of parallel. Now we can obviously get a little technical here, but basically when you run normal speakers in parallel like that, it requires a lot of power from the system. That can damage the receiver. So they ran, you can see here, they ran the door and the dash in a straight line in series. And that uses a lot less power, but you do lose some volume. So it's a trade-off, considering the risk to the system versus the loss of power. Now, that all would have been great if they actually matched the positive and negative wires correctly to begin with. I had to double check it because I didn't believe it at first, but both the rear and the door speakers were switched. So this is supposed to be, this white with green is supposed to be a positive. It's functioning currently as a negative. Now that can really screw up your audio quality. I probably didn't realize it because the subwoofer made up for that quality loss, but it's still something that, should be avoided. Honestly, this was good just taking everything apart, testing everything so I could identify stuff like this. So we'll come back and we'll fix all these problems, but for now, let's look at how the radio is supposed to be wired from the factory. Okay, so there are a few official diagrams already out there like this. There's also this one, and these were the basis of what I used, but I wanted to take it a step further and actually understand the connection points and the pin locations, so I started visualizing it. So we'll start here. Behind the dash is the main wiring harness that connects the radio, amp, and the speakers. And as you can see, there are 6 connection points here. So we'll start from the beginning, where power comes in from the battery and the various fuses and relays. A, the power junction, and that comes in and goes all the way over to the other end of the bundle of cables where it connects to power the radio in different ways. At B, where there's constant power for the clock, switched accessory power to supply the main power, day versus night, instrument illumination inputs, and the ground back to the battery. With that power, plus the radio antenna input, which we'll add for good measure, the radio can send the signal out to the speakers, and that starts with the speaker's output connection C, where there's a line for each positive end of the speaker, and then where I believe there could be a negative back for each speaker, but instead it looks like the amp consolidates all of that into a single common black negative wire, and they only use one of the available pins. So if you were going to install an aftermarket amp but keep the factory radio, you'd start here, have a line for each positive and negative wire, run that through a standalone line output converter first, because most factory radios always send out a high speaker level signal which needs to be converted to low level before going into the amp and then out to the speakers. But back to the standard factory setup, let's keep following this through the wires, then go out to an amp input connector D along with the inputs from the power junction A, which shares power right before it gets to the input to the radio. It splits, and there's also that orange and blue wire in the middle there coming from the radio. They labeled as power antenna turn on, but what I really think that functions as is an amp turn on when signals detected, like it's labeled above, but I'm pretty sure both of those inputs do the same thing. So all that goes to the amp and then out to the amp output connector E, and now this is where I ran into a big problem because this is where E runs to the speaker junction F, and then out to the rest of the speakers, including that parallel split for the door and the dash. And just a small point here, some others like Gearhead 704 and Raymond Urias have pointed out that there's a standard pattern that Ford broke here, where they switched pins 2 and 6 from where they would typically be, so just keep that in mind if you're wiring an aftermarket connection. But anyway, right here is where my wires were cut, so I could get pretty close by matching each of the color wires, but Ford actually decided to use 2 of the colors twice, so what I ended up doing was buying a used amp and taking it apart and figuring out where each wire goes on the board and figuring out the patterns based on like letters Ford used on the board itself where each wire connects. And yeah, this was a lot, but I ended up figuring it out. So to the right we have each wire and what it functions, and then a diagram at the bottom where each pin is on the incoming and outgoing side. So using all this, we can get a final view of all the connections, and it looks like this. And this should be how my premium system was wired, and it's going to be the basis of what I use for fixing what I have. So if I didn't touch anything, this is theoretically what it should look like from the factory. I've noticed that those colors in the middle to and from the amp may be a little different depending on the specific amp you have, but the pin locations and the connections are all the same. So with that, now we can look at how I'll update my system and how it can work with that new factory radio. Now we have a choice to make. We could go aftermarket amp, or we could keep the factory amp. Now I already have the aftermarket speakers. I'm definitely not going back to the OEM speakers, and honestly, I don't care if they're aftermarket if no one's going to see them anyway. They're just going to add to the sound, but I really wasn't planning on investing a lot in this whole setup, so I figured I'll just start with factory and then upgrade later down the line if I feel the system needs it. Now, because we're still using those aftermarket speakers, we're still going to have to deal with that impedance issue. We can't just go back to the parallel wiring of the door and the dash because, like we talked about, it may break the amp without that dash capacitor. These original amps, they were made for the original speakers, and those original speakers have an impedance of, I think, about around 6 ohms. So you really shouldn't go below that. And then, when you wire them in parallel, my new 4 ohm speakers then combine in parallel and go all the way down to 2 ohms, which we know when it's expecting 6. So you really, that's just kind of a bad combination. It's going to be a lot of power that the amp probably can't handle. So I think the obvious choice here is we'll wire them in series, keep it, the way it was in my system before. And that is actually going to have the opposite effect, and it'll make it 8 ohms instead of 6. So, obviously it'll be able to handle that. It'll just be a little quieter. Now, in doing with these aftermarket speakers, the rear are now going to be 4 ohms versus 6. So there is going to be, a little bit of risk there, some stress on the amp, but I feel like it's a risk I'm willing to take. I'll just, be easy on the system. All right, so I think I have everything ready now. Now I could have corrected the switched positive and negatives in the door and rear, but I figured I'd just roll with it and keep it as is. So obviously these colors are going to be unique to my system, but all the connections should still be the same. It's pretty easy to tell which is positive and negative because the positive is the larger connector, but I also confirmed with the battery test where I wired up a AA battery to the speakers, negative to negative, positive to positive, and then just checked to make sure that the speakers were firing outward, like you can see here. So next what I had to do was cut all these wires at the aftermarket splices and then figure out how I was going to connect to the amp. Luckily, I came across this same style wiring harness on Amazon. I'll put the link in the description. So I took out all the pins and then I reorganized them and put them back matching the factory plug positions on the amp output. And then based on the labels of each of the wires, I soldered them to the matching speaker wire using these really cool self-solder heat shrink connectors. And then, once that was done, I could plug, everything back together the way it originally was. So you can see here, first I connected the radio power. Then I connected the radio antenna, then I moved on to the radio speakers, and then moved over to the amp connection. So I put in the amp input, and then lastly, the newly wired amp output. And that, obviously goes out to the speakers. And one last thing before we put all this together, the aftermarket head unit required them to drill through the actual trim plate that's part of the center console. So I had to use some plastic weld and then fill those gaps and then sand it all flat and then apply some adhesion promoter followed by, just black paint before we could reinstall everything back together. All right, and here we are at the end. I got everything put back. I got the amp and all the wires and everything behind the radio sorted out. And yeah, this is the final product, and I think it looks good. I think it looks sort of the way it was always supposed to look. So let's give it a test run here. We start with the clock, then we can turn on the power. It'll start with the radio, and then it'll auto-connect with those upgrades to whatever Bluetooth device you have paired. And then we'll give it a little test here. Obviously you won't be able to hear all the detail, but it's good. It's good bass, really good clarity with those aftermarket speakers, and yeah, it does the job. I tested the fade, the balance, the treble, the bass, all that works well. The passenger, the line that ran to the passenger seat subwoofer, I just tucked those right there. You can see the little red wire. Not sure what I'm going to do with those yet. I'll probably end up getting rid of them eventually, but just wanted to make sure, this system is what I wanted. And yeah, it was a lot, but figured it all out, and I'm happy with the result. So hopefully this can help you guys out, and yeah, we'll see ya.